My name is Brandy from DQ, and I will be moderating the W3C Rules for Accessibility session brought to you by Wilco Theaters. I'm going to take care of a few housekeeping things before I hand it over to Wilco. First, today's session is being recorded and will be hosted on demand for attendees. Slides will also be available for today's session on the web page below. Second, if you require live captions for today's session, you may access those on the session page just below this video screen. And lastly, we'll save the final 10 minutes of today's session for Q&A, so please post your questions in Slido's Q&A section as they come up on the right-hand side of this video. No need to wait until the end to post them. We can post them throughout the session. And with that, I will turn it over to Wilco.
Thank you, Brandy. So, hello everyone. Today I want to talk to you about the W3C rules for accessibility. These are called Accessibility Conformance Testing Rules, ACT for short, and I will be referring to these as ACT rules for the remainder of the talk. Just so we're all on the same page, W3C stands for the World Wide Consortium, the World Wide Web Consortium, apologies, and it is the organization that is responsible for lots of web standards. We are creators of HTML, of CSS, but also of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, which the ACT rules relates to. So, about me, my name is Wilco Fears. I work at DQ Systems. I am the facilitator for the ACT Task Force, which is a group at the W3C that falls under the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group. The Accessibility Guidelines Working Group are the people behind WCAG 2, WCAG 3, and a bunch of related contents. I am the co-chair of the ACT Rules Community Group. The community group is going to be side group of the task force. I'll get into the difference between them in a little bit more details later. And at DQ, I am the product owner of AXCore and of AXLint, which I hope you will join me in my later presentation. So that's me, and let's talk about ACT rules. So we started the ACT project some 6-ish years ago. And the goal for that was to solve or at least reduce differences in interpretations of WCAG. So WCAG is this internationally recognized standard for testing accessibility of digital content. The challenge, however, with WCAG is it is hard to test WCAG very consistently. WCAG 2 was created, the goal of it was to roughly have an 80% consistency. So if you've got 10 experts, at least 8 of them would agree on a certain thing, which is fairly reasonable as far as standards go, especially ones that need to stand the test of time like WCAG does. So WCAG was written in a way that as technologies change, it would continue to be relevant. One of the problems with the first version of WCAG, WCAG 1, was that it got outdated. Actually fairly soon after it was released. And they wanted to avoid that in WCAG 2, and the way they did that is to create technology agnostic requirements. So unlike WCAG 1, WCAG 2 does not say anything specific about what to do in HTML, PDF, or other technologies like that. It's agnostic. But the challenge with that is because there's nothing specific for the languages you're writing your website in. There's an interpretation that needs to happen. And that interpretation often happens slightly differently in different organizations. So if you are asking one organization to do an audit for WCAG, you're going to get results back, and those results may differ in minor points from what you would get from another organization. That creates this strange, did you or did you not meet the requirements kind of scenario. I want to stress that those are fairly minor things. Most of the time, WCAG tests will be consistent, but there are lots of areas in web standards where it isn't always quite clear cut. You can argue either way. Should it meet the requirements? Does it not? And ACT rules are designed to help us solve this problem. ACT rules, they're designed to make test procedures interchangeable. So what we wanted to do is to have this set of rules that one organization could make some, another organization could make some, could be put together as a combined rule set. And it should be rules that could be used if you're building an accessibility tool, but also if you're doing a manual accessibility audit. In a talk of my colleague Glenda yesterday, she presented some results that showed that slightly more than half of the accessibility issues can be detected automatically. The other half needs to be done manually, so there's an interplay going on between those two. And what we wanted to do is to develop this library of commonly accepted rules for WCAG. So it shouldn't just be a rule set that DQ says is the right way to do, or that some other accessibility company says is the right way to do. We wanted to harmonize this so that there's a universally accepted approach to accessibility testing. And we wanted to do this through a community effort. So we've been building this community group out to do lots of this rule writing. So what exactly is an ACT rule, you may ask at this point? And the way I would describe it is, firstly, they are technology-specific tests. So like WCAG 2, what I described before, where WCAG 2 is technology agnostic so that it can continue to be applicable as the technologies develop. ACT rules are very specific to the technologies that we use. This lets us get very consistent, very precise. It also means that as the technologies change, we need to update the rules. Secondly, the ACT rules use ambiguous language. One of the greater challenges in accessibility is if something can be read in more than one way. There are several places in WCAG where you can say, okay, this can be explained this way or this other way. Which is it? How do you decide that? ACT rules are purposely written to try to avoid those scenarios. If there is more than one way to interpret a particular phrase, it is not allowed in an ACT. This is kind of an ongoing process as we learn more and as we learn how to write these things better. We develop the skills to make, to find these common pitfalls and to avoid them, so we get better at this. I think so far we've done a fairly good job of doing this. Third thing to note about ACT rules is that they are backed by test cases. If you'll know, WCAG has a lot of understanding documents which may have one or two examples of how a particular success criterion is supposed to be applied. That is usually not enough if you want to ensure consistency. So if you have a tool, for example, you need more than one or two test cases to know that that tool has done the right thing. So in ACT rules, what we've done is we've written lots and lots of test cases. these help us ensure that whoever says we are doing we are implementing this particular rule, they can prove that by showing how what they've done works in test cases. And lastly, but also very important point, is ACT rules are implementation independent. So an ACT rule is true whether or not you're doing a manual audit, whether or not you are building an accessibility tool using traditional procedural programming. If you're using a hierarchical structure, a kind of a decision tree approach to your accessibility tools, if you're using machine learning, all of these are different ways that you can test for accessibility, and the ACT rules will help. They will support this, so they're written in a way that doesn't prescribe which one of those solutions to take.
Falas muito bom
This
disso,
is another
nada.
very important thing for us. Like I mentioned, the ACT rules are maintained by the ACT task force. I mentioned this earlier, they are part of the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group. And the first thing we did when we started this ACT project is to create the ACT rules format. The ACT rules format is the standard that says how to write a rule that meets those 4 requirements that I talked about in my previous slide. So it describes what to do with your test cases. It describes how to write an unambiguous rule. It describes where you can be subjective in your rule, where it has to be objective. It makes sure that whatever you're doing in your tests, you can write the ACT rule that you write will work for you. So the rules format is really the foundation based on which this rules work has been developed. The ACT task force is then responsible for reviewing rules proposals. We have a community group that writes a lot of rules, and it is the task force that is responsible for maintaining the quality of those. So task force is really the gatekeepers to ACT rules. And the task force maintains a set of WCAG consistent ACT rules. This is the WCAG rule set. I'll get to that in a little bit more detail later. I mentioned a community group, and there are a number of organizations that have written ACT rules. There is the ACT Rules Community Group, which I am co-chairing, that has been writing rules for HTML, for CSS, and for SVG. There are other groups outside that have some rules. They are not nearly as advanced as the community group with HTML, but there's some work on EPUB and on PDF with ACT as well. And to kind of lay this out, this structure, have this overview on my screen. It's at the bottom where it starts off with the ACT rules format. That is really the foundation on which a lot of what we've done is based. Above that are various sources, and a source you can imagine something like Xcore, which is a tool that DQ has developed. Xcore has various rules in it, and these rules can be used to create ACT rules. There are other tools out there too that have their own rule sets, and these rule sets are then written up in a way so that they become ACT rules. So ACT rules are really fine-grained descriptions of how such a tool does their testing. Another possible source could be a testing procedure. There are various testing procedures out there. Lots of organizations have their own description on how to test a particular success criteria. A fairly well-known one is the Trusted Tester program, which is a US government program that has a very precise description of how to test for WCAG. There's some tools in there, there are test procedures in there. That's another example of a thing that ACT can be applied to. So once these ACT rules are created, they can be implemented by tools. So let's say an organization like Signing Proof has a rule, they've written that up as an ACT rule, and they publish that rule, then an organization like DQ can use that rule and implement it in X core. And that way we get greater consistency. And we get a community that can learn from each other's implementations. And all of that builds towards consistent test results. So if we have, by using these ACT rules, different organizations using completely different tools, using completely different testing methodologies, as long as those are based on published ACT rules, they will get far more consistent test results. So just to give some examples, because all of this has been fairly theoretical, here's 4 rule titles on my screen. There's the button has non-empty accessible name rule, which is fairly self-explanatory. It checks that buttons, it's just a rule of a button, have a non-empty accessible name. This is the type of rule that can be implemented in accessibility tools. So lots of accessibility checkers out there have rules like this. The next one on my screen is the heading is descriptive rule, which is not a kind of rule that you would see in a tool, but is very much the type of rule that a trusted tester would have. Or if you're familiar with DQ audits, the DQ way would have. There's the element with array hidden, has no focusable content, slightly more complicated one, where there's a combination of different technologies here where ARIA and focusable content, if you combine them in the wrong way, it will create an accessibility problem. And they're the fairly common and kind of my go-to rule for explaining ACT is HTML page has non-empty title. And I want to go into that a little bit more. So HTML page has non-empty title. The way an ACT rule is broken up is it has its applicability, and then it has some number of expectations. The applicability describes in great detail what the rule applies to. So lots of things cannot be applicable. When it is, the ACT rule describes this for you. So the applicability of this particular rule, the HTML page is non-empty title, is this rule applies to the root element of the web page if it is an HTML element. So just to let that sink in for a second, so it applies to the root element. So if you're familiar with web technologies, a web page is essentially a tree, and the lowest node is called the root node. And if that root node is an HTML element, then this rule applies. Then the first expectation says each target element has at least one descendant that is a title element. So in the applicability, we've selected this root element only if it is an HTML element. And then we're checking that somewhere up in that tree, there must be a title element. And that's our first expectation. The second expectation is says for each target element, again, that's the root, and the first HTML title element that is a descendant of the document element as children that are text nodes that are not only white space. So to unpack that statement a little bit, what this is looking for is this is the title element from that first expectation has to have essentially something that isn't white space. So a completely empty title element would fail this. A title element with just spaces in it would fail this. But if there's some text in there, this rule would pass because both expectations are true. You'll also notice that this is not the entire WCAG success criterion. The WCAG success criterion says that a title must describe the topic or purpose of the page. So this is a subset of the broader success criterion. ACT rules are always subsets. So this narrows the scope, but it narrows it in a way that is well defined and can be implemented consistently. Also on my screen, some of these words are underlined. These are things that are defined. So web page here is underlined, descendant is underlined, title element is underlined, document element, text nodes, and white space. For many of these definitions, there's actually the link goes directly to the HTML specification. HTML5 tells you what it is, and then it tells you what a document element is, it tells you what a text node element is. So ACT rules don't have to define that, but by referencing the specifications themselves, there's a very precise description. Let's go to the next slide. One of the things that isn't defined is that term of web page. And web page has in WCAG 2 has the definition. I'll read it out for a second. It is called a non-embedded resource obtained from a single URI using HTTP plus any other resource that are used in the rendering or intended to be rendered together with it by a user agent. That's a fairly complicated definition of a web page, relying specifically on URI and HTTP, which again may sound very specific, but it also does not apply to HTML. There's nothing in here about HTML. So what we did in the ACT rule, we've defined an HTML web page, which again links back to the use of web page in the previous slide. As an HTML web page is a set of all fully active documents, and fully active just basically means it has to be rendered. If your browser is minimized, a document is non-active, so it doesn't apply. You don't need those things to have a title. Only once it's actually on the screen does it matter. And so it's a fully active document which share the same top-level browsing context. A top-level browsing context is essentially the outermost bit of a web page. It is, if you think of a web page, there are often iframes in a page, and you can have iframes inside of iframes inside of iframes. Each of those frames, as well as the outermost page, is a browsing context. And so the top-level browsing context is just the top-level one. And this again is a thing that is defined in the HTML specification. Along with this rule, there are test cases, and I just picked a couple of them here just to show what they're like. There's a past example 1. This is inside of the rule. There is a title element with some text inside of it that would pass the rule. It meets both of those expectations. And what's not on this slide here is the actual HTML content. You may imagine an HTML and a head element around these. I've left that out for the sake of brevity, but there's also a failed example here, which is failed example 5 from the rule, which is the title element with a space character and then a non-breaking space HTML entity, which also resolves to a white space character. So you'll see that if an organization implements this rule in a naive way, they might not catch this. And the ACT rule is specific here that if you're using HTML entities, those also have to be tested. And then as an inapplicable example, there's an SVG, which is not to say that SVGs don't need titles, but this is left out of the rule about HTML pages. So SVGs also can have the title element. There are different requirements for titles on SVG, so those are left out and they are called inapplicable. So just practically, what has that work, all of that work, resulted in? So ACT has been adopted in various tools over the past 6 years. There's been definitely a boost in the last 2 or so. It is used in a number of testing methodologies. Again, it has been used in research, and it has resolved some long-standing interpretation differences. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. So the ACT project as a whole, the ACT task force has produced the rules format. It has to date reviewed 32 rules. It has published 11 of those. And you can find those rules on the W3C website today. The community group, on the other hand, has created 91 ACT rules in total. There are 1,114 test cases to go with those 91 rules, and there are 7 documented implementers. And those implementers are, in terms of accessibility tools, there's Alpha, developed by SiteImprove. There's Xcore by DQ. There's QualLab, which is a tool produced by the University of Lisbon, which is used by the Portuguese government. And there is SortSite, which is produced by PowerMapper, which is a company in Scotland. There's some other ones too that have 1 or 2 rules that they have mapped to ACT, but these are the ones that we have extensive data on how well they have implemented ACT rules in their particular products. So this isn't just a theoretical thing, this is a thing that is changing tools today. In terms of methodologies, I mentioned Trusted Tester before. There's a member of the Trusted, who's worked on the Trusted Tester program in the ACT task force. And she's helped us a lot in refining accessibility rules. Here's ACT rules are currently used by the Norwegian government in their monitoring efforts, and the Portuguese government also uses it in their monitoring efforts. This is a project called AMA, which I believe is on GitHub, if you're interested to find it. And the ACT has also been used in some research. The Canadian government last year did a research project into tools, and to determine the quality of those tools, what they did is they compared various tools to the, I believe at the time it was 800 or so test cases. It is up to 1,100 at this point. And so they ran these tools to compare them to figure out which tools are consistent with the rules that have been developed in this group. And just to give some examples of what those interpretation differences are that we've resolved by these ACT rules. The first one relates to that title rule that I brought up. Do title elements in the body count as a title for a page? The HTML specification on this says you're not supposed to put a title in the body. However, if you do, this will work. The first title in any page, regardless of if it's in the head, or in the body, or wherever you want to put it, the first title element is always the title of the page. This is one of those things that wasn't tested consistently. When we wrote this rule, we found that out. And by writing this rule, some tools and methodologies have changed their approach. Now they are testing this consistently. Another one, I'll need to go through this a little bit more quickly, I see. Do disabled buttons require an accessible name? There was some discussion on this. We ended up deciding that yes, even though disabled buttons may be skipped by assistive technologies, when you tab through them, they still need an accessible name. If you read WCAG carefully, that is the conclusion we have come to. Do all iframes need an accessible name? The conclusion there was it depends a little bit. If you're using rule none or rule presentation, it may not. Almost all other cases, yes, it does. There's various reasons, and we've documented those in the rules that we've written. And the last one on my screen is, does the lang tag have to be valid? And underneath there is lang equals, and then in quotes, EN-United States, end quote. Which the EN dash, that is definitely a valid part, but the dash United States is not how you're supposed to write the lang attributes. And we have tested this extensively. We've compared this to various specifications, and it turns out this works. It does not let you switch the United States part. That does not work, but the first bit, the EN bit, to announce that a particular piece of content is in English, this works consistently. So this is allowed by the ACT rules and to extend by WCAG then. Because that is the goal of what we're trying to do. We're publishing these ACT rules to further refine how to interpret WCAG. We're not done. ACT rules, we've done a lot of writing, and we're very close to the point where ACT rules will become an integral part of WCAG. So WCAG 2.2 will publish with a number of ACT rules. Some of the rules can already be found on the W3C website, but when WCAG 2.2 gets published, these rules will be integrated in the understanding documents of WCAG. So the understanding success criteria will have a section about rules, if there are any rules for the particular success criterion. There are links from the techniques to the rules. And there will be an understanding ACT rules document as well to go together with the understanding techniques document that exists in WCAG already. So really, really excited about that. This is something we've been working towards for several years now, and this is really where we're hoping ACT rules can grow further. The next thing to do is to develop an implementation tracker. ACT rules, like I mentioned, we have some test data from a number of organizations, but you may have also noticed not all mainstream accessibility tools are on that list. That is something we are hoping to change. So the W3C website will have an implementation tracker on it, which will show you how many rules a particular tool or a particular testing methodology has implemented. So you'll be able to see how many of these rules does a tool have. You will be able to select tools based on how many rules do they have, how well do they do compared to these published ACT rules. I'm really not supposed to call this a benchmark, but this starts to get to a point where we can benchmark accessibility tools. It gives us a platform where we can say, okay, if you want a tool that is consistent with how the W3C interprets WCAG, you can use this implementation tracker to figure out which tool best stands for it. And the last point here that we are working on is to collaborate with the Silver Task Force, which is a group that is currently working on WCAG 3. We want greater consistency in WCAG 3 testing than we did for WCAG 2. And I think we are going to get there with the ACT. So we will work with this group, and we have been working with this group to see how we can do that. So again, this WCAG 3 rule set, we are going to continue publishing rules. We have 11 of them. We are hoping to get a lot more of these out. The process that we have adopted has been a little slow, so we need to figure out a way to speed things up. There's a backlog of about 80 rules that we need to get through, and I'm hoping that we can do that. The task force will continue to maintain these rules. It is very important for the rules that they get maintained. So unlike the WCAG techniques, which get written and then are done, the goal of ACT is to actively maintain these rules. So we're going to review every rule every single year to make sure it's still up to date, to make sure the accessibility support data is active, to make sure that all of the specifications are up to date. It's important for these rules to stay up to date, so that is what we're working on. And like I mentioned, these are going to be integrated in the WCAG resources, so in the understanding documents, in the WCAG techniques, you will soon find the ACT rules. The implementation tracker is a little bit more speculative. We have yet to start this work in earnest, but we are at the verge of starting to do that. This implementation tracker will show the results of various tools and various methodologies, how they compare to the test cases in ACT rules. This can result in a consistent or a partially consistent implementation, and it'll show both automated, semi-automated, and manual results. The data format we are using for that is going to be JSON link data, and it's going to use Earl if you are interested in that kind of thing. I get very nerdy about that stuff, but I won't get into it here. Collaboration with WCAG 3, I already spoke about that. We really want to improve the consistency in WCAG 3. So tools should be able to test WCAG 3 far more consistently than we get out of WCAG 2 today. And to just see this in action, I'm talking about X4 because I'm the product owner of X4. I'm going to take my ACT chair hat off for a second and talk just as a product owner. What we have done in X4 is we've added an ACT tag. This tags exactly which rules that are currently published by the W3C are implemented by X4. This has resulted in a number of new rules and in a bunch of bug fixes that we've uncovered because of ACT. To list out the new rules that have come from ACT, so these are rules that have come from other organizations. They're developed in the ACT Rules community group, and so just to list them out: the no autoplay audio rule in Xcore, the identical link same purpose rule, ARIA toggle field name, ARIA input field name, scrollable region focusable, CSS orientation lock, SVG image alt. And if you want to know more about these rules, I recommend you look on DQ University. We have great help pages which describe in more detail what exactly these do. There's a number of bug fixes that we went through as well. The meta viewport rule, which checks that you don't restrict the zoom size, can now handle negative values. And this is just a thing we missed. And when we were going through writing this ACT rule, we found that problem and we fixed it in Xcore. So it has concrete results of tools that use these ACT. It means we all get better by using ACT rules. For color contrast in Xcore, in the last year we added support for text shadow. Xcore will now take your text shadows into account when computing with text contrast. Text shadow doesn't do a lot on your contrast most of the time, but if you stack up a number of text shadows, it can really make a difference. And so because of ACT, because ACT had test cases to show to deal with this text shadow, we've added that to Xcore. We are on the ARIA roles rule next. We're now accepting white space and null values. So if you leave the role attribute empty, that does not cause an accessibility problem. I'm not sure why we filled that in X before, but we don't anymore because of ACT rules. Object alt rule now allows rule none and rule presentation. And lists, if you have a list, a UL element or an OL element with rule none, Xcore did not used to understand that doing that also resulted in the children of that element to have rule none, and now it does. So these are very concrete things that have improved because of ACT rules, because we have a documented definition of how to do these things. And you'll see these same changes in the other tools I mentioned. It's the only way to pass all of those test cases is to make sure these things are covered by the tools, by methodologies that you're using. I'm just real quick, the numbers. Xcore currently has 31 of the 82 rules that are drafted implemented. In Xcore, this results in 40 rules actually, because rules don't have a one-to-one mapping. Some rules in ACT may end up being 2 rules in Xcore or the other way around. And from the published rules, the ones that are currently on the W3C website, Xcore has implemented all 11 of them. Those are in Xcore 16. Just count the ACT tag is on 16 rules that maps to the 11 rules that is published. So currently Xcore fully implements these. You'll also notice that 31 is a lot less than 82. That is partially because there's a lot of semi-automated and manual rules in ACT. So Xcore itself will never have full coverage, but if you're using XPro, for example, we are looking at implementing ACT rules there, and we are hoping to get the full range there too at some point. Just real quick, if you would like to get involved, our website is w3.org/community/ACT-R. That is the community group where you can join. If you would like to join the task force, you can email shadi@w3.org. That is SHADI. He's the staff contact for the ACT task force. And if you would like to, if you have a tool that you would like to see on the rules websites, you can look at act-rules.github.io/pages/implementations/overview. And with that, I am done. Brandy, do you have any questions?
That was awesome, Wilco. Thank you. Really great job. You do have questions, quite a few. So let's go ahead and dive into them.
Awesome.
First question is there a rule of thumb on how the ACT task force determines what would be deemed as priority when making the rule sets? And is there a rule of thumb that you would suggest?
There isn't. Currently, the way we're going about this is to go by number of implementations. We would like to see at least one complete implementation of a rule before it gets published on the W3C website. There is some talk about changing up the process, but right now that is the main driver of priority, is who has an implementation that is fully consistent with what the rule says.
Another question here is, do you know what the time frame is for adoption of the remaining ACT rules?
I think there's 2 answers to that. It's on the one hand, adopting them for publication on the W3C websites. There's no concrete time frame for that. Like I said, the process has slowed down and currently depends on getting implementations. So unless there is a full implementation of a particular rule we currently have, don't publish them. So it really depends on different organizations. As for Xcore itself, I think we have implemented most things that we can implement. We're definitely continuing to look at implementing more rules. This is more of a gradual process at this point. I think there are still a couple of rules that can be implemented in Xcore that we haven't. It's on my priorities list to deal with those, but there's lots of other stuff I'm working on too. So.
Thank you. Someone wasn't clear on the distinction between the task force rules and the community group rules. Do community rules eventually get adopted by the task force?
Yes. So that's an important and often confusing piece of it. So the community group is the group that writes the rules, and the task force is the group that decides whether or not they can be published by the W3C. Or specifically, the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group is ultimately responsible for that, but the task force is a gatekeeper on that. The goal is definitely to have all of the rules published eventually, but the community group really is focused on writing these and defining these, and the task force only picks up the ones that have a proven implementation.
This one got upvoted a couple times. Someone wondering where it's possible to find the Canadian government tools research.
Ooh, I am not sure I know how to get to that. Is that something we can tweet out later or email out later?
Oh, possibly. Yeah, good note.
I'll have to look into that. I'll make a note of that.
Okay, awesome.
See if we can distribute that. Please ping me directly. I'll be sure to. I'm on Slack in lots of places, or you can email me wilco.fierce@dq.com.
And then someone asked, will the ACT project lead to more consistency between the various testing tools?
That is absolutely the intent, and I think it already has. For the tools that I've mentioned, there's far more consistency between those than there was 3 years ago. I am hoping we can get more tool developers to adopt this approach. It's one of the reasons we want to publish the implementation track on the W3C websites. It is also why I'm having this up now. Please go ask your local tool developers if they have data on ACT rules. I would love to see more of this. I think this is really important for our industry to be more consistent, to focus on having a strict interpretation, because it really hurts our industry to have just different tools giving different opinions about the same thing, even though they're supposed to test the same thing. It's really strange thing that this is happening, and it's a problem that we should fix. So please encourage whoever is your local tool developer to adopt this work.
Awesome. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. And someone asked, what does ACT mean for international legislation for digital accessibility?
Oh, that's a great question. ACT work, I probably should have mentioned this earlier. ACT work is largely driven by the European Commission. There's been some funding for the work. A lot of the work that has happened in the community group over the last 3 years was funded work. And the European Commission has funded this work specifically to test more consistently. Europe has monitoring that is going on. Every European country is supposed to monitor its government websites for accessibility, and they're reporting every 3 years. And so it's really important that those results are consistent. So that is one of the reasons they're interested in this work, helping us push this forward. Similarly, Trusted Tester is looking at this work. We don't want these differences. They kind of arise from just people having opinions and having to make quick decisions and documenting what they've done. This at the high level, at the monitoring level, this is really where it starts to matter, because you can't have Norway being super strict and Italy being really kind of lenient and thus ending up with a better score. That's just not a workable solution. And it's not going to work if you're delivering a website that has to conform in both countries. Having this consistent everywhere is really important for that reason.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Wilco. It looks like we're at time here. So that will conclude our session for today, and I want to thank you again and thank everyone for attending.
Thank you.